The sun beat down mercilessly, the dust swirling in thick clouds as the heat of the land swallowed everything in its path. In the heart of the Great Depression, one man's simple invention would offer a glimmer of relief from the suffocating heat. But would it be enough to survive the crushing weight of the Dust Bowl? Before we dig into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and if survival stories of grit and ingenuity touch your soul, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale might just outlast this one. It was late summer in the Dust Bowl, the relentless wind sweeping through the parched earth like a living thing. Dust storms had become a part of everyday life, choking the air and clouding the sun. For the farmers, the worst seemed to be behind them, but the storms were unyielding. And with every new storm, the soil was swept away a little more, leaving behind barren, lifeless land. Walter Harris had built his life on the land. His homestead sat on the edge of the Oklahoma plains, where the earth was cracked, thirsty, and unforgiving. When he had first arrived, the land had been alive with the sounds of cattle, the wind rustling through tall grasses, and the promise of a future. But that was before the storms came. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers stiff from days of hard labor under the oppressive sun. It was too hot to work in the fields, but there was always something that needed fixing, something that needed mending. His barn, once a sturdy refuge, now looked like it might collapse under the weight of the dust that had settled on its roof. Walter's wife, Martha, worked tirelessly inside their small home, doing what she could to preserve the family's dwindling supplies. They had been forced to ration food for months now, relying on what little they could grow in the stony soil. But it wasn't just the food that was wearing them down. It was the constant, choking heat and the thick dust that seemed to invade every corner of their lives. The air was so dry it burned to breathe, and no amount of water could seem to wash the dirt from their skin. Walter had heard of an idea, an invention, really that could offer a bit of comfort in this unbearable heat. It wasn't much, but it was something. The man who had devised it had promised that, for the cost of a few materials, it could change the way people survived the summer heat. A cooling system that didn't rely on electricity, an idea that had caught Walter's interest from the moment he'd heard of it. The thought of standing in the cool, refreshing air, free from the thick blanket of dust and the searing heat, seemed impossible, but Walter had to try. He had made his way to the small town of Granfield to find out more. As he passed the dry fields and empty houses, he couldn't help but feel the weight of despair in the air. Everyone was struggling to hold on, but nobody seemed to know how to fight back against the relentless heat. It was in Granfield that he met with the inventor, a quiet man named John Beckett, who had a reputation for being a bit of a dreamer. He was a mechanic by trade, but it was his cooling device that had garnered the most attention. Beckett explained the concept in simple terms. He had created a large frame, a simple wooden structure that could be filled with water-soaked cloth, allowing the evaporative cooling process to offer a welcome relief. Walter wasn't sure it would work, but he was desperate. Desperation had a way of making men believe in things that seemed too far-fetched. And so, with little more than hope and a few dollars, Walter purchased the parts he needed to build his own version of Beckett's cooling system. The heat of the next day was unbearable. As Walter set to work, the sweat poured down his back in thick, salty streams, stinging his eyes as he nailed together the frame for the cooling system. The days had been blurring together, a haze of dust and exhaustion. But Walter's mind was focused on one thing now, the hope that this invention would give them even a fraction of the comfort they had lost. Martha watched him work from the porch, her eyes hollow from the long months of hardship. She hadn't shared Walter's optimism about the cooling system. She had seen too many schemes fail, promises made and broken in a land that refused to be tamed. But she was too tired to argue. As Walter fitted the final piece of the frame together, he stepped back to take a look. The structure was simple, 2 long wooden beams on either side, with a mesh of burlap stretched between them. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The real work would come next. He filled the burlap with water, soaked the cloths with as much water as the land could offer, and watched as the sun beat down upon it. Slowly, the water began to evaporate, creating a gentle, cooling breeze that Walter could feel on his face. It was a small miracle, nothing like the cooling systems in the cities, but it was something that made the unbearable heat feel a little less oppressive. Martha stepped forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Is it working?" she asked, her voice tentative, as if she didn't want to hope. Walter nodded, the first smile in weeks pulling at the corners of his lips. "It's working, Martha. It's working." The cool air wasn't much, but it was enough to give them both a sense of relief. They sat down on the porch together, the dust still swirling outside, the heat still pressing down, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they found themselves able to breathe. The land still held them captive, the storm still raged, but in that moment, they had something the dust couldn't take away: hope. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Walter could hear the wind picking up once more. Another dust storm was coming, but this time he wasn't as afraid. They had found a way to endure, to survive, and even in the harshest of times, survival was something worth fighting for. Days turned into weeks, and Walter's cooling system, humble as it was, became an unexpected sanctuary in the relentless heat. The storms that swept across the plains seemed less menacing now, if only because the cooling breeze from the simple contraption gave the Harris family a moment of peace amidst the chaos. But peace was fleeting on the plains, and the winds weren't the only force they had to contend with. The land, already parched from months of drought, seemed to push back harder with every passing day. Martha noticed it first, the quiet conversations among their neighbors, the growing unease in their eyes. The storm clouds were always on the horizon now, thick and black with the promise of dust. Farmers who had once worked side by side, sharing tools and tips, were now pulling away. Walter had always known there was something to fear about the coming months, but it wasn't until the silence crept in that he truly understood how desperate things had become. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the winds picked up, a knock at the door interrupted their evening routine. Walter opened the door to find Frank Lawson, a neighbor from 3 farms down, standing on the porch. His face was drawn, his hat low over his eyes, and his clothes were dust-covered from the long trek. "Can I come in?" Frank's voice was low, almost apologetic. "Of course," Walter replied, stepping aside. "What's going on, Frank?" Frank hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder at the wind that was picking up speed. The first storm of the season was approaching, and Frank's face was a reflection of the land itself, tired, worn out, and broken. "It's bad, Walter," he said finally, stepping inside and looking at the cooling system with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. "I thought I could make it, thought we'd all make it, but I don't know how much longer I can keep the farm running. We've lost too much, the soil, the crops, everything." Walter nodded, though the weight of his words hung heavily in the room. He knew exactly what Frank was talking about: the ever-decreasing returns from the soil, the blinding storms, the constant fight against nature. But there was something else in Frank's eyes, something more than just fatigue. There was a fear that came with knowing the land might not give back anymore. "I'm thinking of packing it in," Frank said finally, "selling up, heading to the city. At least there's a chance there. Maybe we'll find something to hold on to." You ever thought of leaving?" Walter felt a knot in his chest, the words stinging more than he had expected. It wasn't just Frank's loss he was hearing, it was his own. For months, he had resisted the idea of leaving, telling himself that this was his home, that they could make it through, that this land was theirs to survive. But what if Frank was right? What if there was no way to keep going? "I've thought about it," Walter admitted, his voice softer than he intended. "But not yet. Not until there's no other choice." Frank gave him a long look, then nodded grimly. "It's coming, Walter. I don't think we can hold out much longer, but I had to ask. Maybe you'll come with us. Maybe we can all find something better, somewhere else." Walter didn't have an answer. His mind raced, torn between his instinct to survive and the overwhelming pressure of the land's unyielding nature. The storm was picking up, the wind howling outside, and Walter's cooling system hummed faintly in the background. For the moment, it was enough. But he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be enough for long. The decision to stay or leave wasn't made overnight. It lingered between Walter and Martha like an invisible weight, suffocating in its quiet intensity. The nights were the hardest when the dust settled on their windowsills, when the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, and when the temperature outside dipped so low that even their thickest quilts couldn't keep out the cold. The cooling system had become a lifeline for them, offering a moment of respite in an otherwise relentless world. But the storms continued to grow more frequent, each one more violent than the last. The first heavy storm of the season, that October blizzard, was just the beginning. Walter worked on his farm through it all, hauling water, fixing fences, gathering firewood, but the land was no longer forgiving. It wasn't just the crops that had failed, it was the very soil beneath his feet. The fields were dry and cracked, too weak to hold anything anymore. No amount of water, no amount of care could save them. One morning, after a particularly brutal night, Walter woke to find the dust thick in the air, clinging to the trees, to the porch, to his very skin. He went outside and stood in the wind, feeling it whip against his face like the lash of a whip. For a moment, he considered Frank's offer to leave, but the stubbornness in him, the part that had kept him fighting for so long, refused to budge. Martha joined him outside, her hands on her hips, her eyes squinting against the dust. "We can't keep doing this, Walter. I'm worried. We've got to think of the future." "I know," Walter said, his voice rough from the dust. "I know, but I don't think we can leave just yet. Not unless we're absolutely sure it's over. Not unless we're absolutely sure there's nothing left for us here." And so, the days passed in a blur of dust, sweat, and exhaustion. The cooling system continued to hum in the background, a small comfort in the face of the overwhelming storms. The wind continued to howl, the dust continued to settle, and the land, though barren, still held them captive. As the final storm of the season raged outside, Walter made a promise to himself. He would survive. They would survive, but in the silence of the storm, one question gnawed at his mind: how much longer could they hold out? The final storm came without warning. It wasn't the loud, violent rush of wind that they had grown accustomed to, but a thick, suffocating stillness that enveloped the plains. For 3 days, the sky was a dull, oppressive gray, and not a single gust of wind dared to stir the dust. It was as if the earth itself had exhausted its fury, leaving only the silence in its wake. Walter sat outside, his back against the doorframe of their cabin, staring out at the land that had once been full of promise. The quiet was unnerving. It had been too long since they had heard the wind. Too long since the dust had swirled through the air like an unstoppable force. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't hear the land calling out in desperation. It was as though even the dust had worn itself thin, exhausted by the months of battling for survival. Martha joined him after a while, a bundle of clothes draped over her arm. She sat down beside him, her eyes as tired as his. They both knew that the land was gone. There was no more work to be done, no more crops to grow, no more hope of reclaiming what had been lost. The promise of the plains had faded with every dust storm, and now the silence only seemed to deepen the weight of their reality. "I think it's time, Walter," Martha said softly, breaking the stillness that had settled around them like a heavy blanket. "We can't keep fighting it. Not like this." Walter nodded, but the words were hard to form. They had been fighting for so long, for so much. The idea of leaving the land felt like admitting defeat, something he had never been willing to accept. But now, sitting in the midst of this barren silence, he realized that sometimes survival meant knowing when to let go. "I've been thinking about Frank," he said quietly. "Maybe he was right. Maybe it's time we found somewhere else, somewhere we can start over. But not just for us, for the kids too. I don't want them to grow up like this." Martha leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We've given it our best shot, Walter. Sometimes you can't make something work no matter how hard you try. But I'm not ready to give up on us. We'll find a way. I know we will." The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air between them. But in the stillness, there was a sense of relief, as if the land itself had finally let them go. Walter looked out at the empty horizon, the cracked earth that stretched before them, and felt a quiet sorrow mixed with a glimmer of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from believing things would get better on their own. It was the kind of hope that came from knowing they had each other, and that, no matter where they went, they would find a way forward. Later that evening, as the first stars began to appear in the clear sky, Walter and Martha made their play-stars-botted decision. They would pack what little they could carry and leave. The land had taken everything it could, but they weren't done yet. They still had each other, and they still had the will to keep going. As they stood together, looking out at the land one last time, Walter couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet acceptance. The storms had torn at them, had tested every limit they had, but they had endured. And now, as the dust settled for good, they were free to leave the past behind and step into whatever future awaited them. The next day, they packed up their few belongings and set out, leaving the once promising land behind. But in the silence of that moment, Walter knew that survival wasn't just about holding on to what you had, it was about knowing when to let go and having the strength to move forward.